Hello, and welcome back to another episode of the Western Canon Challenge, where we are reading the entirety of the Western literary canon out loud. Today we are beginning the third book of The Will to Power by Friedrich Nietzsche, and this is subtitled The Principles of a New Valuation, and we are on section 1, of course, and this is entitled The Will to Power in Science. Then under this, another subtitled A, the method of investigation, and then we get to aphorism or section I'm just going to start calling them aphorisms without any equivocation about it. We are up to aphorism 466. With that said, I'll get started. The distinguishing feature of our 19th century is not the triumph of science, but the triumph of the scientific method over science. 467. The history of scientific methods was regarded by Auguste Comte almost as philosophy itself. 468. The great methodologists, Aristotle, Bacon, Descartes, Auguste Comte. 469. The most valuable knowledge is always discovered last, but the most valuable knowledge consists of methods. All methods, all hypotheses on which the science of our day depends, were treated with the profoundest contempt for centuries. On their account, a man used to be banished from the society of respectable people. He was held to be an enemy of God, a reviler of the highest ideal, a madman. We had the whole pathos of mankind against us. Our notion of what truth ought to be, of what the service of truth ought to be, our objectivity, our method, our calm, cautious, and distrustful manner were altogether despicable. At bottom, that which has kept men back most is an aesthetic taste. They believed in the picturesque effect of truth. What they demanded of the scientist was that he should make a strong appeal to their imagination. From the above, it would almost seem as if the very reverse had been achieved, as if a sudden jump had been made. As a matter of fact, the schooling which the moral hyperboles afforded gradually prepared the way for that milder form of pathos, which at last became incarnate in the scientific man. Conscientiousness in small things, the self-control of the religious man, was a preparatory school for the scientific character, as was also in a very preeminent sense the attitude of mind which makes a man take problems seriously, irrespective of what personal advantage he may derive from them. B. The starting point of epistemology. 470. Profound disinclination to halt, once and for all, at any collective view of the world. The charm of the opposite point of view. The refusal to relinquish the stimulus residing in the enigmatical. 471. The hypothesis that, at bottom, things proceed in such a moral fashion that human reason must be right, is a mere piece of good-natured and simple-minded trustfulness, the result of the belief in divine truthfulness, God regarded as the creator of all things. These concepts are our inheritance from a former existence and a beyond. 472. The contradiction of the so-called facts of consciousness. Observation 1,000 times more difficult, error is perhaps the absolute condition of observation. 473. The intellect cannot criticize itself simply because it can be compared with no other kind of intellect, and also because its ability to know would only reveal itself in the presence of actual reality. That is to say, because in order to criticize the intellect, we should have to be higher creatures with absolute knowledge. This would presuppose the existence of something, a thing in itself, apart from all the perspective kinds of observations and senso-spiritual perception. But the psychological origin of the belief in things forbids our speaking of things in themselves. 474. The idea that a sort of adequate relation exists between subject and object, that the object is something which, when seen from inside, would be a subject, is a well-meant invention which, I believe, has seen its best days. The measure of that which we are conscious of is perforce entirely dependent upon the coarse utility of the function of consciousness. How could this little garret prospect of consciousness warrant our asserting anything in regard to subject and object, which would bear any relation to reality? 475. Criticism of modern philosophy. Erroneous starting point, as if there were such things as facts of consciousness, and no phenomenalism in introspection. 476. Quote-unquote consciousness. To what extent is the idea which is thought of, the idea of will, or the idea of a feeling, which is known by us alone, quite superficial? Our inner world is also quote-unquote appearance. 477. I am convinced of the phenomenalism of the inner world also. Everything that reaches our consciousness is utterly and completely adjusted, simplified, schematized, interpreted. The actual process of inner quote-unquote perception, the relation of causes between thoughts, feelings, desires, between subjects and object, is absolutely concealed from us and may be purely imaginary. This quote-unquote inner world of appearance is treated with precisely the same forms and procedures as the outer world. We never come across a single fact. Pleasure and pain are more recently evolved intellectual phenomena. Causality evades us. To assume the existence of an immediate causal relation between thoughts, as logic does, is the result of the coarsest, most clumsy observation. There are all sorts of passions that may intervene between two thoughts, but the interaction is too rapid. That is why we fail to recognize them. That is why we actually deny their existence. Quote-unquote thinking, as the epistemologists understand it, it never takes place at all. It is an absolutely gratuitous fabrication arrived at by selecting one element from the process and by eliminating all the rest, an artificial adjustment for the purpose of the understanding. The quote-unquote mind, something that thinks, at times even the mind absolute and pure, this concept is an evolved and second result of false introspection, which believes in quote-unquote thinking. In the first place, an act is imagined here which does not really occur at all, in other words, thinking, and secondly, a subject substratum is imagined in which every process of this thinking has its origin, and nothing else. That is to say, both the action and the agent are fanciful. 478. Phenomenalism must not be sought in the wrong quarter. Nothing is more phenomenal, or to be more precise, nothing is so much deception as this inner world which we observe with the inner sense. Our belief that the will is a cause was so great that according to our personal experiences in general, we projected a cause into all phenomena, i.e., a certain motive is posited as the cause of all phenomena. We believe that the thoughts which follow one upon the other in our minds are linked by some sort of causal relation. The logician, more especially, who actually speaks of a host of facts which have never once been seen in reality, has grown accustomed to prejudice that thoughts are the cause of thoughts. We believe, and even our philosophers believe it still, that pleasure and pain are the causes of reactions, that the very purpose of pleasure and pain is to occasion reactions. For hundreds of years, pleasure and pain have been represented as the motives for every action. Upon reflection, however, we are bound to concede that everything would have proceeded in exactly the same way, according to precisely the same sequence of cause and effect, if the states pleasure and pain had been entirely absent, and that we are simply deceived when we believe that they actually cause anything. They are the attendant phenomena, and they have quite a different purpose from that of provoking reactions. They are in themselves effects involved in the process of reaction which takes place. In short, everything that becomes conscious is a final phenomenon, a conclusion, and is the cause of nothing. All succession of phenomena in consciousness is absolutely atomistic, and we try to understand the universe from the opposite point of view. as if nothing were effective or real, save thinking, feeling, willing. 479. The phenomenalism of the quote-unquote inner world. A chronological inversion takes place so that the cause reaches consciousness as effect. We know that a pain is projected into a certain part of the body, although it is not really situated there. We have learnt that all sensations which were ingenuously supposed to be conditioned by the outer world are, as a matter of fact, conditioned by the inner world, that the real action of the outer world never takes place in a way of which we can become conscious. That fragment of the outer world of which we become conscious is born after the effect produced by the outer world has been recorded and is subsequently interpreted as the cause of that effect. In the phenomenalism of the inner world, the chronological order of cause and effect is inverted. The fundamental fact of inner experience is that the cause is imagined after the effect has been recorded. The same holds good of the sequence of thoughts. We seek for the reason of a thought before it has reached our consciousness. And then the reason reaches consciousness first, whereupon follows its effect. All our dreams are the interpretation of our collective feelings with a view of discovering the possible causes of the latter, and the process is such that a condition only becomes conscious when the supposed causal link has reached consciousness. The whole of inner experience is founded on this, that a cause is sought and imagined which accounts for a certain irritation in our nerve centers, and that it is only the cause which is found in this way which reaches consciousness. This cause may also have absolutely nothing to do with the real cause. It is a sort of groping assisted by former inner experiences, that is to say, by memory. The memory, however, retains the habit of old interpretations, that is to say, of erroneous causality, so that inner experience comprises in itself all the results of former erroneous fabrications of causes. Our quote-unquote outside world, as we conceive it every instant, is indissolubly bound up with the old error of cause. We interpret by means of the schematicism of the thing, etc. Quote-unquote inner experience only enters consciousness when it has found a language which the individual can understand. That is to say, a translation of a certain condition into conditions with which he is familiar. Quote-unquote understand means simply this: to be able to express something new in the terms of something old or familiar. For instance, I feel unwell. A judgment of this sort presupposes a very great and recent neutrality on the part of the observer. The simple man always says, "This and that makes me feel unwell." He begins to be clear concerning his indisposition only after he has discovered a reason for it. This is what I call a lack of philological knowledge. To be able to read a text as such without reading an interpretation into it is the latest form of inner experience. It is perhaps a barely possible form. 480. There are no such things as mind, reason, thought, consciousness, soul, will, or truth. They all belong to fiction and can serve no purpose. It is not a question of subject and object, but of a particular species of animal which can prosper only by means of a certain exactness, or better still, regularity in recording its perceptions, in order that experience may be capitalized. Knowledge works as an instrument of power. It is therefore obvious that it increases with each advance of power. The purpose of knowledge. In this case, as in the case of good or beautiful, the concept must be regarded strictly and narrowly from an anthropocentric and biological standpoint. In order that a particular species may maintain and increase its power, its conception of reality must contain enough which is calculable and constant to allow of its formulating a scheme of conduct. The utility of preservation, and not some abstract or theoretical need to eschew deception, stands as the motive force behind the development of the organs of knowledge. They evolve in such a way that their observations may suffice for our preservation. In other words, the measure of the desire for knowledge depends upon the extent to which the will to power grows in certain species. A species gets a grasp of a given amount of reality in order to master it, in order to enlist that amount in its service. C. The belief in the ego subject. 481. In the opposition to positivism, which halts at phenomena and says, "These are only facts and nothing more," I would say, no, facts are precisely what is lacking. All that exists consists of interpretations. We cannot establish any fact in itself. It may even be nonsense to desire to do such a thing. Everything is subjective, ye say, but that in itself is interpretation. The subject is nothing given, but something superimposed by fancy, something introduced behind. Is it necessary to set an interpreter behind the interpretation already to hand? Even that would be fantasy, hypothesis. To the extent to which knowledge has any sense at all, the world is knowable, but it may be interpreted differently. It is not one sense behind it, but hundreds of senses. Perspectivity. It is our needs that interpret the world, our instincts and their impulses for and against. Every instinct is a sort of thirst for power. Each has its point of view, which it would fain impose upon all the other instincts as their norm. 482. Where our ignorance really begins, at the point from which we can see no further, we set a word, for instance, the word I, the word do, the word suffer. These concepts may be the horizon lines of our knowledge, but they are not truths. 483. Owing to the phenomenon thought, the ego is taken for granted, but up to the present everybody believed, like the people, that there was something unconditionally certain in the notion I think, and that by analogy with our understanding of all other causal reactions, this I was the given cause of thinking. However customary and indispensable this fiction may have become now, this fact proves nothing against the imaginary nature of its origin. It might be a life-preserving belief and still be false. 484. Quote, "Something is thought, therefore there is something that thinks." End quote. This is what Descartes' argument amounts to. But this is tantamount to considering our belief in the notion substance as an a priori truth. That there must be something that thinks when we think is merely a formulation of a grammatical custom, which sets an agent to every action. In short, a metaphysico-logical postulate is already put forward here, and it is not merely an ascertainment of fact. On Descartes' lines, nothing absolutely certain is attained, but only the fact of a very powerful faith. If the proposition be reduced to something is thought, therefore there are thoughts, the result is merely tautology, and precisely the one factor which is in question, the reality of thought, is not touched upon, so that in this form the apparitional character of thought cannot be denied. What Descartes wanted to prove was that thought not only had apparent reality, but absolute reality. 485. The concept substance is an outcome of the concept subject, and not conversely. If we surrender the concept soul, the subject, the very conditions for the concept substance are lacking. Degrees of being are obtained, but being is lost. Criticism of reality. What does a plus or minus of reality lead to? The gradation of being in which we believe? The degree of our feeling of life and power, the logic and relationship of past life, presents us with the measure of being, reality, non-appearance. Subject. This is the term we apply to our belief in an entity underlying all the different moments of the most intense sensations of reality. We regard this belief as the effect of a cause, and we believe in our belief to such an extent that on its account alone we imagine truth, reality, substantiality. A quote-unquote subject is the fiction which would fain make us believe that several similar states were the effect of one substratum. But we it was who first created the similarity of these states. The similizing and adjusting of them is the fact, not their similarity. On the contrary, this ought rather to be denied. 486. One would have to know what being is in order to be able to decide whether this or that is real. For instance, the facts of consciousness. It would also be necessary to know what certainty and knowledge are, and so forth. But as we do not know these things, a criticism of the faculty of knowledge is nonsensical. How is it possible for an instrument to criticize itself when it is itself that exercises the critical faculty? It cannot even define itself. 487. Should not all philosophy ultimately disclose the first principles on which the reasoning process depend? That is to say, our belief in the quote-unquote ego as a substance, as the only reality according to which alone we are able to ascribe reality to things. The oldest realism at length comes to light simultaneously with man's recognition of the fact that his whole religious history is no more than a history of soul superstitions. Here there is a barrier. Our very thinking itself involves that belief, with its distinctions, substance, accident, action, agent, etc. To abandon it would mean to cease from being able to think. But that a belief, however useful it may be for the preservation of a species, has nothing to do with the truth, may be seen from the fact that we must believe in time, space, and motion, without feeling ourselves compelled to regard them as absolute realities. 488. The psychological origin of our belief in reason. The ideas reality, being, are derived from our subject feeling. Subject interpreted through ourselves so that the ego may stand as substance, as the cause of action, as the agent. The metaphysico-logical postulates, the belief in substance, accident, attribute, etc., etc., draws its convincing character from our habit of regarding all our actions as the result of our will, so that the ego as substance does not vanish in the multiplicity of changes. But there is no such thing as will. We have no categories which allow us to separate a world as thing in itself from a world of appearance. All our categories of reason have a sensual origin. They are deductions from the empirical world. The soul, the ego, the history of these concepts shows that here also the oldest distinction, spiritus, life, obtains. If there is nothing material, then there can be nothing immaterial. The concept no longer means anything. No subject atoms. The sphere of a subject increasing or diminishing unremittingly, the center of the system continually displacing itself, in the event of the system no longer being able to organize the appropriated mass, it divides into two. On the other hand, it is able, without destroying it, to transform a weaker subject onto one of its own functionaries, and to a certain extent to compose a new entity with it, not a substance, but rather something which in itself strives after greater strength, and which wishes to preserve itself only indirectly. It wishes to surpass itself. 489. Everything that reaches consciousness as an entity is already enormously complicated. We never have anything more than the semblance of an entity. The phenomenon of the body is the richer, more distinct, and more tangible phenomenon. It should be methodically drawn to the front, and no mention should be made of its ultimate significance. 490. The assumption of a single subject is perhaps not necessary. It may be equally permissible to assume a plurality of subjects, whose interaction and struggle lie at the bottom of our thoughts and our consciousness in general. A sort of aristocracy of cells in which the ruling power is vested. Of course, an aristocracy of equals who are accustomed to ruling cooperatively and understand how to command. My hypotheses. The subject as a plurality. Pain, intellectual and dependent upon the judgment, harmful, projected. The effect always unconscious. The inferred and imagined cause is projected. It follows the event. Pleasure is a form of pain. The only kind of power that exists is of the same nature as the power of will, a commanding of other subjects which thereupon alter themselves, the unremitting transientness and volatility of the subject, quote-unquote, mortal soul, number as perspective form. 491. The belief in the body is more fundamental than the belief in the soul. The latter arose from the unscientific observations of the agonies of the body, something which leaves it, the belief in the truth of dreams. 492. The body and physiology, the starting point. Why? We obtain a correct image of the nature of our subject entity, that is to say, a number of regents at the head of a community, not as quote-unquote souls or as quote-unquote life forces, as also of the dependence of these regents upon their subjects, and upon the conditions of a hierarchy and of the division of labor, as the means ensuring the existence of the part and the whole. We also obtain a correct image of the way in which the living entities continually come into being and expire, and we see how eternity cannot belong to the subject. We realize that the struggle finds expression in obeying as well as in commanding, and that a fluctuating definition of the limits of power is a factor of life. The comparative ignorance in which the ruler is kept of the individual performances and even disturbances taking place in the community also belong to the conditions under which government may be carried on. In short, we obtain a valuation even of want of knowledge, of seeing things generally as a whole, of simplification, of falsification, and of perspective. What is most important, however, is that we regard the ruler and his subjects as of the same kind, all feeling, willing, thinking, and that wherever we see or suspect movement in a body, we may conclude that there is cooperative, subjective, and invisible life. Movement as a symbol for the eye. It denotes that something has been felt, willed, thought. The danger of directly questioning the subject concerning the subject, and all spiritual self-reflection, consists in this, that it might be a necessary condition of its activity to interpret itself erroneously. That is why we appeal to the body and lay the evidence of sharpened senses aside, or we try and see whether the subjects themselves cannot enter into communication with us. Section D. Biology of the instinct of knowledge. Perspectivity. 493. Truth is that kind of error without which a certain species of living beings cannot exist. The value for life is ultimately decisive. 494. It is unlikely that our knowledge extends farther than is exactly necessary for our self-preservation. Morphology shows us how the senses and the nerves, as well as the brain, evolve in proportion as the difficulties of acquiring sustenance increase. 495. If the morality of "thou shalt not lie" be refuted, the sense for truth will then have to justify itself before another tribunal, as a means to the preservation of man as will to power. Likewise, our love of the beautiful, it is also the creative will. Both senses stand side by side. The sense of truth is means wherewith the power is appropriated to adjust things according to one's taste. The love of adjusting and reforming, a primeval love. We can only take cognizance of a world which we ourselves have made. 496. Concerning the multifariousness of knowledge, the tracing of its relation to many other things, or the relation of kind, how should knowledge be of another? The way to know and to investigate is in itself among the conditions of life. That is why the conclusion that there could be no other kind of intellect, for ourselves, than the kind which serves the purpose of our preservation, is an excessively hasty one. This actual condition may be only an accidental, not in the least an essential, one. Our apparatus for acquiring knowledge is not adjusted for knowledge. 497. The most strongly credited a priori truths are, to my mind, mere assumptions pending further investigation. For instance, the law of causation is a belief so thoroughly acquired by practice and so completely assimilated that to disbelieve in it would mean the ruin of our kind. But is it therefore true? What an extraordinary conclusion, as if truths were proved by the mere fact that man survives. 498. To what extent is our intellect also a result of the conditions of life? We should not have it did we not need to have it, and we should not have it as we have it if we did not need it as we need it, that is to say, if we could live otherwise. 499. Thinking in a primitive, inorganic state is to preserve in forms, as in the case of the crystal. In our thought, the essential factor is the harmonizing of the new material with the old schemes, equaling Procrustes' bed, the assimilation of the unfamiliar. 500. The perception of the senses projected outwards, quote-unquote inwards and quote-unquote outwards. Does the body command here? The same equalizing and ordering power which rules in the idioplasma also rules in the incorporation of the outer world. Our sensual perceptions are already the result of this process of adaptation and harmonization in regard to all the past in us. They do not follow directly upon the impression. 501. All thought, judgment, perception regarded as an act of comparing has as a first condition the act of equalizing, and earlier still the act of making equal. The process of making equal is the same as the assimilation by the amoeba of the nutritive matter it appropriates. Quote-unquote memory late, insofar as the equalizing instinct appears to have been subdued. The difference is preserved. Memory, a process of classification and collocation. Active. Who? 502. In regard to the memory, we must unlearn a great deal. Here we meet with the greatest temptation to assume the existence of a soul, which, irrespective of time, reproduces and recognizes again and again, etc. What I have experienced, however, continues to live, quote, in the memory, end quote. I have nothing to do with it when memory comes. My will is inactive in regard to it, as in the case of the coming and going of a thought. Something happens, of which I become conscious. Now something similar comes. Who has called it forth? Who has awakened it? 503. The whole apparatus of knowledge is an abstracting and simplifying apparatus, not directed at knowledge, but at the appropriation of things. Quote-unquote end and quote-unquote means are as remote from the essence of this apparatus as quote-unquote concepts are. By the end and the means, a process is appropriated. A process is invented, which may be grasped. But by concepts, one appropriates the things which constitute the process. 504. Consciousness begins outwardly as a coordination and knowledge of impressions. At first, it is at the point which is remotest from the biological center of the individual. But it is a process which deepens and which tends to become more and more an inner function, continually approaching nearer to the center. 505. Our perceptions, as we understand them, that is to say, the sum of all those perceptions, the consciousness whereof was useful and essential to us, and to the whole organic process which preceded us. Therefore, they do not include all perceptions, for instance, not the electrical ones. That is to say, we have senses only for a definite selection of perceptions, such perceptions as concern us with a view to our self-preservation. Consciousness extends so far only as it is useful. There can be no doubt that all our sense perceptions are entirely permeated by valuations, useful or harmful, consequently pleasant or painful. Every particular color, besides being a color, expresses a value to us. although we seldom admit it, or do so only after it has affected us exclusively for a long time, as in the case of convicts in jail or lunatics. Insects likewise reach in different ways to different colors. Some like this shade, the others that. Ants are a case in point. 506. In the beginning, images, how images originate in the mind, must be explained. Then words applied to images. Finally, concepts, possible only when there are words, the assembling of several pictures into a whole which is not for the eye but for the ear, word. The small amount of emotion which the word generates, that is, then, which the view of the similar picture generates, for which one word is used, this simple emotion is the common factor, the basis of a concept. That weak feeling should be all regarded as alike, as the same, is the fundamental fact. There is therefore a confusion of two very intimately associated feelings and the ascertainment of these feelings. But who is it that ascertains? Faith is the very first step in every sensual impression. A sort of yea saying is the first intellectual activity. A holding a thing to be true is the beginning. It were our business, therefore, to explain how the holding of a thing to be true arose. What sensation lies beneath the comment, true? 507. The valuation, quote, I believe that this and that is so, end quote, is the essence of truth. In all valuations, the conditions of preservation and of growth find expression. All our organs and senses of knowledge have been developed only in view of the conditions of preservation and growth. The trust in reason and its categories, the trust in dialectics, and also the valuation of logic, prove only that experience has taught the usefulness of these things to life, not their truth. The prerequisites of all living things and of their lives is that there should be a large amount of faith, that it should be possible to pass definite judgments on things, and that there should be no doubt at all concerning all essential values. Thus it is necessary that something should be assumed to be true, not that it is true. Quote, the real world and the world of appearance. End quote. I trace this contrast to the relation of values. We have posited our conditions of existence as the attributes of being in general, owing to the fact that in order to prosper, we must be stable in our belief. We developed the idea that the real world was neither a changing nor an evolving one, but a world of being. E. The origin of reason and logic. 508. Originally, there was chaos among our ideas. Those ideas which were able to stand side by side remained over. The greatest number perished, and are still perishing. 509. The kingdom of desires out of which logic grew, the gregarious instinct in the background. The assumption of similar facts is the first condition for similar souls, for the purpose of mutual understanding and government. 510. Concerning the origin of logic. The fundamental proneness to equalize things and to see them equal gets to be modified and kept within bounds by the consideration of what is useful or harmful. In fact, by considerations of success, it then becomes adapted in such wise as to be gratified in a milder way, without at the same time denying life or endangering it. This whole process corresponds entirely with what external and mechanical process, which is its symbol, by which the protoplasm continually assimilates, makes itself to itself, what it appropriates, and arranges it according to its own forms and requirements. 511. Likeness and similarity. 1. The coarser the organ, the more apparent likenesses it sees. 2. The mind will have likeness, that is to say, the identification of one sensual impression with others already experienced, just as the body assimilates inorganic matter. For the understanding of logic, the will which tends to see likeness everywhere is the will to power. The belief that something is so and so, the essence of a judgment, is the result of a will which would fain have it as similar as possible. 512. Logic is bound up with the proviso, granted that identical cases exist. As a matter of fact, before one can think and conclude in a logical fashion, this condition must be first assumed. That is to say, the will to logical truth cannot be consummated before a fundamental falsification of all phenomena has been assumed, for which it follows that an instinct rules here, which is capable of employing both means. First, falsification, and secondly, the carrying out of its own point of view. Logic does not spring from a will to truth. 513. The inventive force which divides the categories worked in the service of our need of security, of quick intelligibility in the form of signs, sounds, and abbreviations. Quote-unquote, substance, subject, object, being, becoming are not matters of metaphysical truth. It was the powerful who made the names of things into law, and among the powerful it was the greatest artist in abstraction who created the categories. 514. A moral, that is to say, a method of living which long experience and experiment have tested and proved efficient, at last enters consciousness as a law, as dominant. And then the whole group of related values and conditions become part of it. It becomes venerable, unassailable, holy, true. A necessary part of its evolution is that its origin should be forgotten. That is a sign that it has become master. Exactly the same thing might have happened with the categories of reason. The latter, after much groping and many trials, might have proved true through relative usefulness. A stage was reached when they were grasped as a whole, and when they appealed to consciousness as a whole, when belief in them was commanded, that is to say, when they acted as if they commanded. From that time forward they passed as a priori, as beyond experience, as irrefutable. And possibly they may have been the expression of no more than a certain practicality answering the ends of a race and a species. Their usefulness alone is their truth. 515. The object is not to know, but to schematicize, but to impose as much regularity and form upon chaos as our practical needs require. In the formation of reason, logic, and the categories, it was a need in us that was the determining power, not the need to know, but to classify, to schematize, for the purpose of intelligibility and calculation. The adjustment and interpretation of all similar and equal things, the same process which every sensual impression undergoes, is the development of reason. No pre-existing idea had anything to do with it. But utility, which teaches us that things can be reckoned with and managed only when we view them roughly as equal. Finality in reason is an effect, not a cause. Life degenerates with every other form of reason, although constant attempts are being made to attain to those other forms of reason. For life would then become too obscure, too unequal. The categories are truths only in the sense that they are the conditions of our existence, just as Euclid's space is a conditional truth. Between ourselves, as no one will maintain that men are absolutely necessary, reason, as well as Euclid's space, are seen to be but an idiosyncrasy of one particular species of animals, one idiosyncrasy alone among many others. The subjective constraint which prevents one from contradicting here is a biological constraint. The instinct which makes us see the utility of concluding as we do conclude is in our blood. We are almost this instinct. But what simplicity it is to attempt to derive from this fact that we possess an absolute truth. The inability to contradict anything is a proof of impotence, but not of truth. 516. We are not able to affirm and to deny one and the same thing. That is a principle of subjective experience, which is not in the least necessary, but only a sign of inability. If, according to Aristotle, the principium contradictionis is the most certain of all principles, if it is the most ultimate of all and the basis of every demonstration, if the principle of every other axiom lie within it, then one should analyze it all the more severely, in order to discover how many assumptions already lie at its root. It either assumes something concerning reality and being, as if these had become known in some other sphere, that is to say, as if it were impossible to ascribe the opposite attributes to it, or the proposition means that the opposites should not be ascribed to it. In that case, logic would be an imperative, not directed at the knowledge of truth, but at the adjusting and fixing of a world which must seem true to us. In short, the question is a debatable one. Are the axioms of logic adequate to reality, or are they measures and means by which alone we can create realities, or the concept reality? In order to affirm the first alternative, however, one would, as we have seen, require a previous knowledge of being, which is certainly not the case. Their proposition therefore contains no criterion of truth, but an imperative concerning that which should pass as true. Supposing there were no such thing as A identical with itself, as every logical and mathematical proposition presupposes, and that A is in itself an appearance, then logic would have a mere world of appearance as its first condition. As a matter of fact, we believe in that proposition under the influence of an endless empiricism which seemed to confirm it every minute. The quote-unquote thing that is the real substratum of A, our belief in things, is the first condition of our faith in logic. The A in logic is, like the atom, a reconstruction of the thing. By not understanding this, and by making logic into a criterion of real being, we are already on the road to classification of all those hypostases, substance, attribute, object, subject, action, etc., as realities. That is to say, the conception of a metaphysical world or a real world. This is, however, once more the world of appearance. The primitive acts of thought, affirmation, and negation, the holding of anything for true and the holding of a thing for not true, insofar as they do not only presuppose a mere habit, but the very right to postulate truth or untruth at all, are already dominated by a belief that there is such a thing as knowledge for us, and that judgments can really hit the truth. In truth, logic can never doubt that it is able to pronounce something concerning truth in itself. That is to say, that to the thing which is in itself true, no opposite attributes can be ascribed. In this belief there reigns the central and coarse prejudice that our sensations teach us truths concerning things, that I cannot at the same moment of time say of one and the same thing that it is hard and soft. The instinctive proof, quote, I cannot have two opposite sensations at once, quote, is quite coarse and false. That all contradiction in concepts should be forbidden is the result of a belief that we are able to form concepts that a concept not only characterizes, but also holds the essence of a thing. As a matter of fact, logic, like geometry and arithmetic, only holds good of assumed existences which we have created. Logic is the attempt on our part to understand the actual world according to a scheme of being devised by ourselves. Or more exactly, it is our attempt at making the actual world more calculable and more susceptible to formulation for our own purposes. 517. In order to be able to think and to draw conclusions, it is necessary to acknowledge that which exists. Logic only deals with the formulae for things which are constant. That is why this acknowledgment would not in the least prove reality. That which is part of our optics, the ego regarded as being, not affected by either becoming or evolution. The assumed world of subject, substance, reason, etc. is necessary, and adjusting, simplifying, falsifying, artificially separating power resides in us. Quote-unquote truth is the will to be master over the manifold sensations that reach consciousness. It is the will to classify phenomena according to definite categories. In this way, we start out with a belief in the quote-unquote true nature of things, we regard phenomena as real. The character of the world in the process of becoming is not susceptible of formulation. It is false and contradicts itself. Knowledge and the process of evolution exclude each other. Consequently, knowledge must be something else. It must be preceded by a will to make things knowable. A kind of becoming in itself must create the illusion of being. 518. If our ego is the only form of being, according to which we make and understand all being, very good. In that case, it were very proper to doubt whether an illusion of perspective were not active here, the apparent unity which everything assumes in our eyes on the horizon line. Appealing to the body for our guidance, we are confronted by such appalling manifoldness that for the sake of method it is allowable to us that phenomenon which is richer and more easily studied as a clue to the understanding of the poorer phenomenon. Finally, admitting that all is becoming, knowledge is only possible when based on a belief in being. 519. If there is only one form of being, the ego, and all other forms of being are made in its own image, if, in short, the belief in the ego together with the belief in logic stands and falls with the metaphysical truth of the categories of reason, if, in addition, the ego is shown to be something that is evolving, then 520. The continual transitions that occur forbid our speaking of the individual, etc. The number of beings itself fluctuates. We should know nothing of time or of movement if, in a rough way, we did not believe we saw things standing still, behind or in front of things moving. We should also know just as little about cause and effect, and without the erroneous idea of empty space, we should never have arrived at the concept of space at all. The principle of identity is based on the fact of appearance, that there are some things alike. Strictly speaking, it would not be possible to understand and know an evolving world. Something which is called knowledge exists only insofar as the understanding and knowing intellect already finds an adjusted and rough world to hand, fashioned out of a host of mere appearances, but become fixed to the extent in which this kind of appearance has helped to preserve life. Only to this extent is quote-unquote knowledge possible. That is to say, as a measuring of earlier and more recent errors by one another. 521. Concerning logical appearance. The concept individual and the concept species are equally false and only apparent. Species only expresses the fact that an abundance of similar creatures come forth at the same time, and that the speed of their further growth and of their further transformation has been made almost imperceptible for a long time, so that the actual and trivial changes and increase of growth are of no account at all. A stage of evolution in which the process of evolving is not visible, so that not only does a state of equilibrium seem to have been reached, but the road is also made clear for the error of supposing that an actual goal has been reached, and that evolution had a goal. The form seems to be something enduring, and therefore valuable, but the form was invented merely by ourselves, and however often the same form is attained, it does not signify that it is the same form, because something new always appears, and we alone who compare reckon the new with the old, insofar as it resembles the latter, and embody the two in the unity of form, as if a type had to be reached and were actually intended by the formative processes. Form, species, law, idea, purpose. The same fault is made in respect of all these concepts, namely, that of giving a false realism to a piece of fiction, as if all phenomena were infused with some sort of obedient spirit. An artificial distinction is here made between that which acts and that which guides action. But both these things are only fixed in order to agree with our metaphysico-logical dogma. They are not facts. We should not interpret this constraint in ourselves to imagine concepts, species, forms, purposes, and laws, quote, a world of identical cases, end quote, as if we were in a position to construct a real world, but as a constraint to adjust a world by means of which our existence will be ensured. We thereby create a world which is determinable, simplified, comprehensible, etc. for us. The very same constraint is active in the functions of the senses, which support the reason, by means of simplification, coarsening, accentuation, and interpretation, whereon all recognition, all the ability of making oneself intelligible rests. Our needs have made our senses so precise that the same world of appearance always returns, and has thus acquired the semblance of reality. Our subjective constraint to have faith in logic is expressive only of the fact that long before logic itself became conscious in us, we did nothing save introduce its postulates into the nature of things. Now we find ourselves in their presence. We can no longer help it. And now we would fain believe that this constraint is a guarantee of truth. We it was who created the thing, the same thing, the subject, the attribute, the action, the object, the substance, and the form, after we had carried the process of equalizing, coarsening, and simplifying as far as possible. The world seems logical to us because we have already made it logical. 522. Fundamental solution. We believe in reason. This is, however, the philosophy of colorless concepts. Language is built upon the most naive prejudices. Now we read discord and problems into things. Because we are able to think only in the form of language, we also believe in the eternal truth of wisdom, for instance, subject, attribute, etc. We cease from thinking if we do not wish to think under the control of language. The most we can do is to attain to an attitude of doubt concerning the question whether the boundary here really is a boundary. Rational thought is a process of interpreting according to a scheme which we cannot reject. This is the end of Part 1 of Book 3 of The Will to Power. Thank you for listening.